let's get to America's forgotten socialist history. This is probably going to talk about another presidential candidate who was arrested. All right, let's get to America's forgotten socialist history. This is probably going to talk about another presidential candidate who was arrested and ran from prison, I suspect. That's right, Eugene V. Debs time from friend of the show, Second Thought, America's forgotten socialist history.
This episode is brought to you by Nebula. If you'd like to help support Second Thought,
Second Thought doesn't miss, okay? Straight up, no misses. All hits, no misses, baby.
And the Deprogram, and First Thought, consider signing up for Nebula at the link below. So, socialism. It's not America's favorite thing.
Socialism.
America will never be a socialist country.
It's like if you had two cows, right? And then the government. Ask any American, and they'll tell you this large field of corn we call the US has always been a capitalist country. Ask socialists for that matter. It's honestly pretty difficult to look at the history of the most powerful capitalist country that's ever existed and say otherwise. Whether it's the Red Scare or the Cold War, not to mention all the CIA-backed coups abroad, the US has obviously got a capitalist, anti-communist thing going. And if you watched the last episode, you know that this is something the right likes to weaponize. In this country, progressive ideas are discredited by being labeled Marxism. Marxism gets labeled un-American, and un-American things get labeled destructive, or even evil. It's one of the ways conservatives stigmatize the left's politics, by saying they aren't from here, and that makes them bad and scary.
I will order my government to deny it. Those who come to and join our country must love our country. We want them to love our country. We don't want them when they want to destroy our country. Welcome to America. We want to destroy your country. Thank you very much.
But in this episode, we're going to challenge this idea. While the US has never been governed by a socialist party, that's true, it's not true that socialism isn't a big part of this country's history. And not just because of the Red Scares. Let's start at the beginning. Quick disclaimer before we actually begin, this couldn't in any way be a complete history of socialism in the US. There's just way too much for one video, which kinda tells you everything already. But anyway. Before settler colonists showed up, North America had quite a bit of socialism already.
Damn! My man's saying primitive accumulation? That's, like, he's gonna go... I mean, I guess this is technically not it, but like, I guess this is, right? This could be considered that, right? Indigenous formations that have no interest in like the profit incentive in any way, shape, or form. Primitive communism.
Native Americans, and I'm very much generalizing here, organized advanced societies on this continent oftentimes along pretty socialistic lines, meaning things like collective ownership and management of economic resources, environmental stewardship instead of resource extraction, intra-clan democracy, and multi-clan democratic federations.
It was socialistic, you know, the indigenous socialism collectively. This is why native property wasn't recognized, because it was collectively owned.
That's Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, by the way. She's the author of this book. In it, among other things, she talks about how indigenous nations like the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois, organized along more socialistic and democratic lines than you might expect. Dunbar Ortiz specifically mentions how this allowed Native Americans to thrive for centuries, when, by contrast, some European colonizers in the early 1600s had to resort to cannibalism and coprophagy. Please don't Google that word. According to this famous book by Howard Zinn. Not only was all this happening right here, it's been argued by historians, and even recognized by Congress, that the Haudenosaunee Constitution actually influenced parts of the US Constitution. So beyond just happening in the same place, this history had some bearing on our current government. Though, admittedly, not that much, because, well, we'll get to that. Anyway, calling pre-European America socialist is a bit of a stretch, no doubt about it. North American societies before the Crackening were incredibly different from one another. They had important shortcomings relative to contemporary socialist policy.
No! Does he do that? My man's name is JT. He's a white guy from Texas. If there's one guy who has the card, objectively, it's him. You can't get whiter than a fucking white guy by the name of JT from Texas, brother. Holy fuck.
Politics. And socialism would just have to look very different today, post-industrial revolution. It's interesting, and to this day, socialist politics continue to inspire indigenous activism in the US, with groups like the Red Nation, for example. And vice versa. Marx's ideas of communism, particularly later in his life, drew inspiration from Native American politics. While the Native American genocide did a lot to limit this influence, the US's place in socialist history is actually pretty important. But it obviously doesn't stop there. Let's fast forward a bit to the 1800s. In the US, the early 1800s were a bit of an experimental time for socialists. All across the country, a number of communities sprang up following utopian socialist principles, meaning experiments in creating socialist societies within capitalism. No overthrowing. There was Robert Owen's New Harmony in Indiana, George and Sophia Ripley's Brook Farm in Massachusetts, the North American Phalanx in New Jersey. The Shakers had communities all over the US, and you get the idea. These small communities were organized according to a number of socialist principles, like equality and communality, and they developed around the same time as, slightly before, famous socialist theorists Proudhon and Marx started their inquiry into capitalism and socialism. Rather impressively, some of these experiments lasted quite a long time, however, never at a very large scale. In parallel, though, you had the organized labor movement. From the 1820s to the 1860s, union organizations began to pop up all over the place and started gaining a national scope. First with the National Printers Union, then other unions of craft workers, then trades assemblies and councils and federations, all of which brought unions together under one big umbrella. In 1881, craft unions established the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions of the United States and Canada. And eventually, they realized long names are dumb, and they renamed it to the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, which actually still exists. Today, in 2023, the AFL-CIO is the largest union federation in the US, at 12.5 million members. And although there's a lot to say about it, both then and now, its place in American socialist history is incredibly important, as we'll see in a second. Around this time, you also had massive organizations like the Knights of Labor, which started in 1869 as a secret pro-labor society for workers and non-workers. By 1886, it had grown to over 700,000 members in just over 15 years. And if the date 1886 feels familiar to you, that might be because it's the year of the Haymarket Massacre. If you've never heard about it before, Haymarket was a key moment in socialist history, when several hundreds of thousands of workers from the AFL and the Knights and other organizations went on strike to demand the 8-hour workday all across the US. And in Chicago, at Haymarket, police officers' bullets. Because at this time, socialist and anarchist politics were not just well established in workers' movements, those movements were now well organized and, most importantly, they were big. Just massive unions. This frightened the American ruling class of industrial capitalists, which, up to that point, you can imagine was pretty happy paying workers.
Also important to mention that this is why, although cops are wage laborers in the same way that any other wage laborer is, they are considered class traders by socialist standards, given their antagonistic position to labor movements. Their goal in society is to basically be the enforcers of the state, which is a capitalist state that does not want socialism to exist or does not want a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Close to nothing and making them clock 60-hour work weeks. Anyway, at Haymarket, on May 1st, 1886, one of these 8-hour workday strikes was met by industrialist-funded, brutal police repression. Officers shot and killed 2 striking workers, and in response, workers organized a rally to protest police violence. Officers ordered them to disperse, and a still unknown striker threw an explosive at them. It detonated, killed an officer, and what followed was a full-on shootout that led to the death of 10 more people and the injury of over 70. That summer, 8 prominent Chicago anarchists were put on trial for the death of the police officers involved, and 7 of them were executed. Today, that strike, the massacre...
Ironic, because again, throughout American history, cops kill someone, that's just part of the job. You fight back, any kind of self-defense, and it leads to a cop losing his life, all hell breaks loose. They can now just shoot to kill, just like they were already in the beginning. But now they can shoot even more people and kill even more people. Also, on top of that, now they can fucking turn around and have the state also go through a criminal process, a process in the courts, and then execute with additional state sanctioned executions. I mean, it's crazy.
Massacre and the executions are the big reasons we have International Workers' Day on May 1st. It's celebrating the struggles of workers and socialists for working people's rights. But Haymarket
Ironic because America doesn't celebrate May Day.
Is by no means unique in terms of repression. The late 19th century is when police and military repression of socialists, anarchists, and workers in general really picked up in this country. It's a testament to how popular socialist and labor politics were in the US that 10 years before Haymarket, in 1877, wealthy Chicago citizens raised $28,000, over $800,000 in today's money, to arm the city's police force with rifles, cannons, cavalry equipment, and a Gatling gun? This is kind of shocking, but not really unique either. Basically, the only reason there was a police force in most major cities in the US was because wealthy capitalists wanted a standing, strike-breaking force, in a country where the working class was actively resisting its subordinate role in the social hierarchy.
Videos titled America's Forgotten Socialist History. If you have not subscribed, you should. He's awesome.
Hierarchy. Class war isn't just a euphemism. Employers actively made sure they were well enough armed to wage war against their employees when they complained. It's also at this time that state and federal military forces joined in on the strike breaking, notably in Chicago again during the 1894 Pullman strike. Around 11,000 state and federal troops joined forces with over 3,000 police officers to brutalize striking Pullman workers, whose wages had just been slashed from 25 to 33%, while their rent in a Pullman company town stayed the same. And tell me if this starts to feel familiar, 8 years earlier, industrialists had raised $156,000, $5 million today, for a fort a few miles north of Chicago to make sure the military could quickly enter the city. But let's fast forward again. The 20th century is probably the time where there's the most socialist enthusiasm in US history. But that also means it's when there was the most anti-socialist repression. Undoubtedly, for this kind of video, the 20th century has to start with Eugene V. Debs. Between
the last time someone did everything right and they indicted him. Hasan, they are right-wingers and just hate you because you have a Muslim background and promote socialism. Yeah, I know. You watched the Second Thought video I streamed about a year ago that introduced me to him, and now I watch him consistently off stream too. This is a 100% effective way of spreading the ideology. Yes, I love him because he is so good at cutting easily accessible, easily consumable, agitated propaganda. It's fucking awesome. Anyway, Eugene Debs, the GOAT.
Between 1900 and 1920, Debs ran for president on the Socialist Party ticket, going from less than 100,000 votes all the way up to nearly 1 million in 1920 when he ran after denouncing World War I. Debs was one of the founders of the IWW. He was a leader during the Pullman strikes. He delivered speeches and wrote for the abolition of prisons and property, against racism and inequality and war. Basically every part of American socialism after Debs is marked by this guy. And his massive popularity in a country that actively repressed labor militancy and only has room for 2 political parties who serve the same capitalist interests is a huge testament to the socialist base that's existed here for centuries. But beyond the figure of Debs, who is important, don't get me wrong, it's also important to highlight the victories of the socialist and worker movements as a whole, because there were a lot of them. Usually, when we tell the history of the 20th century, a lot of change gets labeled progress without actually acknowledging how that progress happened. Because a lot of the time, the answer was socialists going out there, shutting down the economy, and burning stuff until things got better. Early 20th century socialist and worker victories included things like ending child labor in the US, securing the right to unionize and strike, the federal minimum wage, and to some extent, most of FDR's New Deal. The New Deal created Social Security, a sort of jobs guarantee, and the 40-hour workweek, and that's despite the fact that FDR wasn't a socialist. The big reason the New Deal happened and was so transformative was because Democrats couldn't handle socialist agitation and worker unrest, and concessions sounded a lot better to them than working-class revolution. Speaking of which, the Red Scare.
If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist.
The 20th century is obviously
I want you guys to understand something about the Red Scare specifically. Part of the only reason why the remnants of the Red Scare still exist, but it's not as like prominent, and like me, someone openly can be a socialist and still exist in civilized society, despite the fact that there's a lot of outsourced bullying and harassment that dumb idiots will engage in, not because they have a personal issue with socialism, just because they've been geared to be angry towards it. But part of the reason why they don't have the same style of McCarthyism, like in Congress, for example, like openly being like, oh, that's socialist, can't be here. We don't have like an un-American activities committee or anything like that, even though it's still technically in place. Like, it's a violation of the First Amendment. You can't be you can't be a communist. That's not a real thing. It's literally illegal. The reason why they don't have that strong of an opinion anymore is because there's not that big of a threat. That's the reality. That's the unfortunate reality. It's not necessarily because the Red Scare has been incredibly successful, and therefore people are just basically, grassrooting this whole anti-socialist propaganda instead of like having Congress push for it. Mostly because there is no real fear. There's no real threat. Like if there was enough trade unionist activity that would threaten the bottom line of American megacorporations, I promise you, they would bring that Red Scare shit back so fucking fast your head would spin, okay?
Remembered for the Red Scares. Socialism was popular in the US, and on the other side of the world, in Russia, for basically the first time, socialism had produced a successful national revolution. Hence the Red Scare. In the US, the first Red Scare is mostly remembered for police forces destroying unions all across the country, and the mass imprisonment of members of the IWW. Then there was the second Red Scare after World War II, which pretty much did the same stuff as the first, just more. Government employees, movie writers and directors, academics, politicians, unionists, members of socialist organizations. They were all investigated by the FBI, black...
Is this taught in American school? I didn't go to school here, so I don't know. The reason why I ask is because, like, people always be like, America has freedom of speech, but, like, here it is, dude. What do you mean? Like, Nazis literally will always talk about how, like, you're calling me a fascist, but what about my free speech? I'm like, bitch, what do you mean? What fucking free speech? Whenever a Nazi chirps about, being blocked due to free speech restrictions, and that means like they violated terms of service horrifically and got banned for it because they're usually a pedophile too, it is a somber reminder of this existing in American history. Like, what do you mean fucking free speech protects your politics? Like, no, it doesn't.
Blacklisted from their industries and thrown in jail after being put through show trials that sent many into hiding. This brings us to the Panthers and the civil rights movements. Now, socialists had been involved in the movement for racial equality since much earlier in the 20th century than the 60s. For example, in Alabama, where black workers organized in the Communist Party against racial capitalism and their oppression during the 30s and 40s. More about that in this great book, by the way. But undoubtedly, the civil rights movement is definitely when this becomes a front and center part of socialist organizing. At the heart of the movement, you have MLK, a socialist, leading the charge. Put some quotes on screen right now. He was a commie. That's just who he was. You also had the Black Panthers. He was a commie. That's just who.
Call it democracy, call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth in this country for all God's children. The evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and the evils of racism. Capitalism has outlived its usefulness. He also was a tanky by American standards. Like, every single person on the liberal side that's like, being a tanky again, because like anytime you're just like anyone that's not America, that America is fighting, if you say like they're human beings and actually deserve to have autonomy, then you're automatically a fucking tanky, right? Just saying that's usually what people claim. He was absolutely a fan of Ho Chi Minh and openly defended him, which drew a lot of ire from the likes of the New York Times and many other people on the liberal side.
Who he was. You also had the Black Panthers, who were even more explicitly commie. They organized free health clinics and breakfasts in black communities, monitored police brutality, advocated for socialism and women's liberation, and got absolutely steamrolled by the FBI and the COINTELPRO assassination program. You also had the gay liberation and feminist movements gaining ground.
I heard that there was a new MLK conspiracy theory recently about how like he didn't actually die like right then and there, and a doctor executed him by suffocating him with a pillow in the hospital or something. I mean, it's a conspiracy theory. It's not real. I mean, he definitely died by being shot. All accounts point to that, for the record. I just want to put that out there. Not new, that's old. Yeah. Well, it's new to me. No, he could have saved him, but chose not to save him. That's the other version of it. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, guys. He definitely was dead. The surgeons refused to work on him and allowed him to die from his wounds? No. Guys, okay, let me explain something. I know I've heard this as well. How do you know? Were you there? I mean, it was a heavily publicized event with a fuck ton of eyeballs. Many of the people that were involved also wrote books. He definitely was mortally wounded by the shot. Okay, stop saying vaccine. Okay, not that shot. He died on the spot. Fact check: Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. died due to the gunshot wound. Yeah, I've heard this is the conspiracy. Yeah. Martin Luther King was killed by the doctor, not the bullet, reads text in a Facebook post published on January 17th, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Oh, I was going to show you guys what tanky is. Here's a Wikipedia page for it. Tanky is a pejorative label for communists and those who align with Marxism-Leninism as an ideology. More generally, the term tanky has been applied for those who express support for one-party communist regimes that are associated with Marxism-Leninism, whether contemporary or historical. It is commonly used by anarchists, libertarian socialists, left communists, reformists, and democratic socialists to criticize Leninism, although the term has seen increasing use by liberals and right-wing factions as well. The term tanky was originally used by dissident Marxist-Leninists to describe the members of the Communist Party of Great Britain who followed the party line of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Specifically, it was used to distinguish party members who spoke out in defense of the Soviet use of tanks to crush the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. That's where the term comes from. And the 1968 Prague Spring Uprising, or who more broadly adhered to pro-Soviet positions. Here's when JT got called a tanky.
Let me read you some details off the list of these bills.
Thoughts on this guy being a tanky? I hope he fucking drives a tank to your house, okay? That's my thoughts on this guy being a tanky. Take a fucking week off and think about how stupid you are as a human being.
In Arkansas.
Damn. It seems like I'm eating right there as well as I'm reacting to yet another one of his videos. And for some weird reason, he's posting this. Well, I mean, it's Ugopnik posting this. It's not Second Thought posting it, but like Ugopnik is his co-host, and they're not posting it and being like, "Why is he eating and not reacting hard?" Instead, it seems like they're celebrating it. It's odd. Anyway, I always looked at it as a pejorative of an ML that supports militarism, so that sounds about right. No, listen. Everybody says tanky this, tanky that. It's a completely bastardized take. The only reason why people weaponize it is because they learned about it. They think it's fun and cool to use a new word. If you're talking to a liberal, they'll say anything. They'll say anything and everything is tanky. Like if you fucking talk about Chinese high-speed rail or whatever, you're like, oh, you're a tanky. That's the reason why I said MLK would be considered a tanky by libs, because he has very openly, very publicly stated support for Ho Chi Minh, critical support, if you will. Tanky has now become the new commie used by liberals who have adopted a radical aesthetic because they realize liberals are cringe, but when push comes to shove, they still parrot the State Department line. Anti-communism repackaged for terminally online Western rad libs. Exactly. I should have not even educated the chat on this matter. It's so stupid.
Around the same time. And they too had a strong anti-capitalist element to them in their attacks on patriarchy and
all you motherfuckers have strong anti-capitalist elements at the top of the hour, okay? When the 3-minute ad break comes, you're like, oh, I have a strong anti-capitalist element, you know? Because if you no longer want to see those ads at the top of the hour, well, turns out you got to do more capitalism. Subscribing for $5 or free with a Twitch Prime by connecting your Amazon Prime account to your Twitch account where you get one free Prime subscription a month. Use it on your favorite broadcaster. Hopefully that's me. Here's the 3-minute ad break now.
Heteronormativity. Then there's the anti-globalization, anti-neoliberal protest of the 90s. Then Occupy, then BLM, then Bernie, then BLM again, and on and on. To summarize this whole video, basically, at any point in US history you want to look, you'll find incredibly popular socialist movements, even at a cursory glance in a short video like this. And when you consider the effect these movements had on society, the rights they clawed from capitalist hands, it's impossible not to see socialism as a huge part of why the US is the way it is. In a good way, like we have a weekend and children aren't in the mines anymore. Socialists have historically been responsible for pushing the progressive wing of the political ruling class to compromise, because when they didn't, the working class in this country fought back. All this to say that socialist politics aren't some kind of new thing, nor some un-American foreign import. Not that either of those should be a bad thing. It's just that socialism is so well established here, and has been for so long, that you couldn't possibly keep pretending that the US doesn't have a proper socialist history. It's simply been forced back time and again by the brutal agents of capital.
It's pretty funny that, like, Albert Einstein, plenty of thinkers in the Oppenheimer biopic, MLK, and numerous other favorable figures throughout history were just like openly socialist. And yet, because people have never been educated on the matter, most people don't know that, and it's been completely written out of history. So now when you bring it up, people just like laugh at you. They're like, "What? No, that's not the case." And there's not really anything you can do about it. Like, there's not really anything you can say to change a lot of people's minds on this matter. Like, they do not give a fuck.
This ideology is no more imported than Adam Smith's or John Locke's ideas of liberal capitalism. But like Marx said, the dominant ideas of every era are the ideas of the ruling class.
I mean, even Adam Smith is a great example of a person who is like hailed as a godfather by so many econ kiddies who just have not read his full works and don't realize that, like, plenty of the things that they advocate for, landlording, for example, are things that Adam Smith was not necessarily fond of. And, you know, people have expanded on those works. You know, a guy that you're seeing, whose name you're seeing on the screen right now, have greatly expanded on his works.
And the ruling class doesn't want to give up the wealth and power they accumulated and built an entire system around way back in their bourgeois revolution against the British. Socialist thought is still here, as much as it's been beaten down, lied about, and forced out of our collective memory by intense and ongoing propaganda campaigns. All we need to do is remember that legacy, learn from the successes and failures of the past, and get involved. You have a branch of a socialist organization near you. Join it. Whether it's CPUSA,
Hasan, have you read Marx? No, I don't read. I've never read. I don't know how to read.
PSL, FRSO, DSA, whatever. Just get involved. I've left links in the description. Socialist power comes from masses of people standing up to oppression. Let's make it happen. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that this video was made possible by Nebula. I'm sure you're all aware of Nebula by now. It's the creator